we think about pronunciation as those who do it perfectly, whatever that means, versus those who are going to be caught. And with accent, everybody gets caught.
Yes.
When I lived in DC, tried to take on a Canadian accent.
Deliberately?
It was a little bit of a game.
Okay.
So you say man, I don't, I say man. But I can do that pure A. I do it in some words anyway, and I can mix it up. Native teachers can be stupid. They can be insistent that all you have to do is follow me. They can assume that a learner can actually do that. And they also think that if they have a native teacher, that this is going to provide a vaccine
Exactly.
against terrible pronunciation. But it doesn't work that way. I think from a teacher's point of view, there are certain things that are going to make a difference and other things that just aren't that important. Basically, the 80-20 principle with pronunciation, that about 20% of the problems that any person has are going to make about 80% of the difference in terms of them being more successful in communicating. And the other 80% you just don't need to do anything about. And you need to be very brave to continue in the language that you're working on when somebody else is rejecting you. If you're thinking in terms of intelligibility, then what you're saying is that all models are valid as long as they are mutually understandable. I had this idea of world Englishes and intelligibility, that it became important only to have the ability to understand each other. That short article that you're talking about, that has the intelligibility principle and the nativeness principle, came about by mistake.
What do you mean?
This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
It's always really amazing to us to see the numbers and how many of you listen to our show, both on the YouTube version and the audio only version. And we really want to thank you for your support. It's also really curious and interesting to see the numbers and the data behind the show, and how many of you who watch the show regularly and support us, but don't actually subscribe to the channel. And before we really dive into the episode today, if we could ask a huge favor of you, and that's very simple, hopefully, is just to hit that subscribe button below this video. That's a really simple way to support us, to allow us to continue to do the show, regularly release regular episodes, incorporate your feedback, to bring in guests that you want to hear from, and just to continue to bring you hopefully a great show that you enjoy listening to. If you like the show, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to talk to us personally about your teaching or your business, there's a link in the show notes on how to do that as well. And now, let's get into today's episode.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Teacher Talking Time podcast. And I am not going to do the usual spiel where I introduce my guest. I think the best way to actually start the conversation today is by asking my guest to introduce himself in a different way. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have none other than John Levis here with us. And John, I wanted to ask you a very specific question. Who is John Levis, and why does your work matter?
I think I'd rather have you introduce me. I am a professor at Iowa State University, and I've been working with research and teaching of pronunciation for about, golly, it's almost 40 years now. I started back when I first went into an MA in TESOL program at the University of Illinois. In my first semester, I took a class in English phonology and morphology for pronunciation teachers. And I fell in love with it. And that's what I've done ever since. At the beginning, I wanted to be an ESL teacher overseas, but then I decided, since I had started late, that I would do a PhD before I left, because I had already been out of school for some time. And then I was afraid that if I went away from being in school again, I would never come back. why does my work matter? That's a really good question. I think it probably matters because I've been able to make connections between different parts of the field that are interested in pronunciation, between um, teachers and between researchers, and have set up some structures that they can work together and talk to each other. So um, I set up a pronunciation conference in 2009, and we're coming up to the 15th year of it now. And it's become the go-to conference for people who are interested in pronunciation in any second language, any additional language. Um, in North America, there are other conferences in other parts of the world, but this is the one that is very much a teaching oriented conference. And then I've done some other things with books and other work that people say they read.
I'll be honest with you. I read quite a lot of them prior to the interview. I have to be honest, John. I didn't know much about your work until we had a guest on the podcast who referenced your work and spoke brilliantly about the work that you do. And eventually I said, okay, I need to read up on this because I clearly don't know enough about this. And that's also the reason why we have the show. And it was Gemma Archer and Robin Walker who were talking about the intelligibility principle. And they said, they mentioned your name. And I said, oh, I'm not familiar with that. Can you tell us more? And I'm actually very happy that we have the person who wrote about that here with us today. I'm interested, John, because you talked about wanting to be an ESL teacher, but then eventually not wanting to leave school and just pursue this. And eventually you decided to stay. But as you've mentioned, you seem to want to play in both playgrounds, also the teaching part and the research part. I think my question to you is what do you think, or what was the aspect of ESL or teaching languages that drew you to the field of second language pronunciation specifically? Was there any moment that you're like, you know what, I actually really want to go down this rabbit hole here?
That probably is mostly influenced by the person who I did my PhD research with, which is Wayne Dickerson at the University of Illinois. Wayne is brilliant, and he's a bit of an evangelist in terms of people who went into his class came out either loving pronunciation or never wanting to see it again. And I was one of the people who loved it. And I worked with him. I was one of his teachers teaching a pronunciation class. And I worked for several years in the summer at a place at Victoria College and University of Toronto doing summer language learning. And that was for people who are going out as missionaries, but who were going to be in situations where they didn't have language classes. They would have had to teach themselves how to learn a language using native speakers. And then I did my PhD with him. And when I finished my doctorate, or even before I finished my doctorate, I got a job, and during that time had kids, and that's why I found it harder to go overseas anywhere. But for the most part, in that between 1986 and around 2002, I mostly taught ESL type classes. I didn't teach as many kind of specialty classes. And I was a TA and then also a teacher of methodology classes for ESL.
I'm curious what drew you to the pronunciation, because I would say that what you shared is consistent with what we, even just in our day-to-day talking with teachers. Pronunciation seems to be one where people love teaching it or people are just, nah, that's not for me. What was it about you that drew you to it?
It just fit with what I thought was interesting. I remember taking in that first semester 3 classes. One was grammar, one was pronunciation, and one was methods and a practicum type of class. And it just was fun. It was one of the things that I liked the best. I would come home in the evening and talk to my wife about what I was doing. She was not an ESL teacher at the time, and she ended up being in the same area that I am as well. But it was always something that I found fascinating. I think with pronunciation, we think of it as accent. And accent is just kind of something that when you don't know much about it, you don't think about it having any kind of structure or any kind of reason for why somebody does one thing rather than another. And in the early training I had, I learned that it was all quite um, sensible. Whereas in my grammar class, the person who taught it was more interested in talking about how grammar was not sensible. So it was an interesting contrast because most grammar teachers like rules.
Not as evangelistic, it sounds like.
No, it was let's go sit at the pub and talk about these things that we're never going to figure out.
Right.
Yeah. And do you think, John, that was coming from your classes, but were you also seeing some of this in your own teaching when you were working with students as you were learning more and more about pronunciation and its different facets?
Yeah, in my second year as a master's student, I ended up teaching the pronunciation class that was meant for ESL students at the university. And it was a kind of mentorship, mentee situation that I've never seen since. So we would go and we would watch Wayne Dickerson teach.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were one day behind him. And then we would teach the same thing to another class on the day following. And it was a pretty amazing kind of thing. And then I ended up being the lead teacher for this in another year.
Mm-hmm.
And then I worked I was the practicum teacher as well for teaching other types of skills besides pronunciation. But mostly that was what kind of kept driving me. I like sounds.
Mm. Yeah. We're going to talk about sounds right now because you actually mentioned
Sounds good to me.
that a lot of people seem to the assumption is that pronunciation is accent. And the term that I heard in the conversation that we had with Gemma and Robin was intelligibility, which is a principle that you wrote in a paper I think in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, where you basically
Yes.
contrasted the nativeness principle with the intelligibility principle. And you're basically suggesting that pronunciation has been at the realm of the former. So I think what would be really interesting for a lot of people who listen to this podcast, a lot of teachers who are not familiar with that, I think perhaps could you walk us through, first of all, how you conceptualize? I'm very interested in the genesis of ideas. Like, how did you come up with this idea of calling it and coining this as the intelligibility principle versus the other one, the nativeness principle? So perhaps talk a little bit about the genesis of that, John, as well as, of course, the fireworks here, as well as the difference. Walk us through the two of them. So I think So teachers do understand that a lot of them who are still teaching to sound like a native speaker, this actually comes from a very specific approach to pronunciations. I'd appreciate if you could do that.
The intelligibility principle came out of a lot of different things. When I was first a pronunciation teacher, nativeness was the focus. But I was at University of Illinois, and the head of our department or our division was Braj Khatru, who is a famous researcher in world Englishes.
Mm-hmm.
And he was Indian and argued that the Englishes around the world that are different from the ones that get prestige status were every bit as systematic and valid as those ones that end up in Cambridge and Oxford textbooks. And that made a lot of sense, and it made a big difference in how I thought about pronunciation. And so I had this idea of world Englishes and intelligibility, that it became important only to have the ability to understand each other, not that everyone should talk like me or talk like you or talk like Gemma, that each person had an accent, but as long as we could understand each other, we didn't have any right to impose a different accent on other people. So that's where the genesis of intelligibility came from. And that came from that 2005 article, which was part of a special issue for TESOL Quarterly. And my colleague, Carol Chappell, was the editor of TESOL Quarterly at that point. And I pitched this idea to her at the time that I'd like to do this special issue on pronunciation, and that I wanted to do on intelligibility and world Englishes and identity, which were the three issues that were central to my thinking. And I thought I would do it in about 3 years, and Carol asked me to give her a proposal the following week. And so I did that. And that short article that you're talking about, that has the intelligibility principle and the nativeness principle, came about by mistake.
What do you mean?
Okay.
I had all of the articles that had come in for the special issue, and I had never done any editing before this. And I found out that I had to write a front piece for the journal special issue. And so I had to pull together these three areas of identity in world Englishes and intelligibility. And I wrote the front piece for it. And I'm still surprised today, because I've gone back and read it a number of times. It's actually pretty good.
It is very well written, very well written.
And short,
Nice.
which
Yes.
is really even better.
Yes.
And it fell into place that this issue of how we thought about pronunciation, that if you think of it in terms of accent, then ultimately you're making decisions about who's best. You have to make that decision, because for a pronunciation teacher's point of view, you put together a way of speaking as a model. And if you're thinking in terms of intelligibility, then what you're saying is that all models are valid as long as they are mutually understandable. inside this kind of decision, there was also the influence of Jennifer Jenkins' work when she did her book in 2000 on the phonology of English as an international language. And Jenny's work looked at how people who were second language speakers of English interacted with other second language speakers of English. And this is one of those places that is a little scary for a pronunciation teacher, because you could likely say, it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
People don't need to pronounce in any kind of convergent way. But that's not what she found. What she found was that when people interacted using English, even though English was not the native language of either of the interlocutors, they often had trouble understanding each other. They were not intelligible, in other words. And there were certain pronunciation features that seemed to be the key to this. And so I think that was another part of what had brought me to this point of seeing these kind of two pieces. Do you want to have a native-like accent? That's the nativeness principle. Do you need to have a native-like accent? And I think the answer to that is obviously no, because there are lots of native accents. They're not necessarily mutually intelligible, and they're not necessarily better than the others. So ultimately, you need to simply see pronunciation as a way that allows you to communicate. And if you can communicate, if you're intelligible, that's what's necessary. You shouldn't make other people do things that you wouldn't do yourself.
It's very interesting, John, because I have to say this. Growing up, I was somewhat forced to adopt a certain pronunciation model. And that was an American model because I was studied in American English. I was exposed to American English. My teachers corrected me and somewhat indoctrinated a way of communicating that somewhat was mimicking an American accent. And that, in a way, really affected me in the sense that I felt that if I could not say a certain word following a certain pattern of pronunciation, I would always be caught. I always felt, oh, somebody's going to catch me. Someone is going to find out that I am this or I'm not a non-native speaker or this or that. But eventually I was able to rid myself of this. I didn't even know at the time because I was the beginning of my teaching career, the nativeness principle. But what you said is very true, that one way of speaking is not better than others. But here's the question I have for you. And you wrote this in the paper that there is, I think the words you used were exactly this. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence against the nativeness principle, but it still affects pronunciation practice. It's still somewhat pervasive. We still have people advertising themselves or schools advertising that we can help you sound like a native speaker, even though we know this is not possible. I think my question to you then is, even though we have an awareness, which I think hopefully after this episode, the intelligibility principle will spread even more so amongst educators, language educators. But John, why is the nativeness principle, I actually have a theory, but I'll talk about this later. Why is the nativeness principle still pervasive in language education? Why is it still here? It's 2024.
It's the easiest way to think about pronunciation. We think about pronunciation as those who do it perfectly, whatever that means,
Right.
versus those who are going to be caught. And with accent, everybody gets caught.
Yes. Yes.
It takes almost no talent whatsoever for a listener to say, you don't sound like me.
Yes.
I can't fit you into my native box. You must be somebody who doesn't speak English or Spanish or whatever language you're talking about. You don't speak it natively. And it's very easy to catch anybody
Yeah.
because there's so many little pieces that are tells. Okay, even for people who are amazing.
Yeah.
You can't avoid it. There are people who can avoid it, but not very often.
Not me. Every time I go to the U.S., you're not from here, are you? Nope.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Well,
Halifax to
you know,
Toronto. Yeah.
this is a really interesting thing. When I lived in DC, I tried to take on a Canadian accent.
Deliberately?
And
Oh, wow.
Really?
Tell us about
Oh,
that.
yeah,
There's a
gosh.
journey.
There we go.
it was a little bit of a game.
Okay.
So there are certain things with a Canadian accent, and it was mostly the segmentals I was focusing on. So you all have a nice pure ah sound. Okay, so you say man. I don't. I say man. But I can do that pure A. I do it in some words anyway, and I can mix it up. You have Canadian raising, so you take in BC or in Vancouver, you take the Sky Train, not the Sky Train like I would do. Or you have the out and about or
Oh, yeah.
Right.
things like that. And I can do those too. And you say sorry,
A lot.
where I
Yes, we
say
do.
sorry.
Yeah.
So Canadian English has that rounded vowel, the aw. I have it, but I don't use it all the time.
When you say you have it, like you mean like in your repertoire, like you have it, it's
Yeah.
available if you are conscious about it.
No, I do it. Yeah.
Oh.
So the man's name and the woman's name, D-O-N and D-A-W-N, I distinguish them. So the man is Don, the woman is Dawn.
Mm.
Okay.
Okay. Canadian English won't distinguish them by and large. You'll say something that's closer to Dawn, mostly. And where I live now, people say Dawn for both.
Oh,
But I grew up in Chicago, so I have them both.
interesting.
And that was the hardest one for me to do in a Canadian accent, because I had to use the aw, the sorry sound,
Mhm.
the tomorrow sound everywhere. And I struggled to do it, even though I had the sound. So I think that was an identity issue that for some reason that one got me.
Very interesting.
Holy.
Okay. Huh.
I didn't try your melody and
It's funny because you wrote a paper on identity and you were talking about individual differences in language learning. And I think you were talking about, I'm trying to remember, that many of the learners in that study that you did, they didn't see a connection. I think I remember the name of the paper. Hold on. It was the learner's view of social issues in pronunciation learning. And there was a very specific part there that I was like, I need to ask John this question. And you just talked about identities in your journey to a Canadian accent. Many of the learners in that specific study, they didn't really see a strong connection between their pronunciation and their identity. I think my question to you then is, how do you think, or perhaps, yeah, how do you think that an awareness or a stronger understanding of this connection could have an impact on their motivation to learn the language and even to the approach to pronunciation learning? Because I feel like a lot of students don't make that connection.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think they don't know. So this was that 2014 paper I think you were talking about.
Yes.
And students don't usually think of pronunciation as really a big part of their identity, especially when they're already adults.
Hmm.
Um, I think when you were giving your story about yourself with the American accent,
Catching. Yeah. Being caught.
um,
Yeah.
it you were probably a teenager.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And as a teenager, you're really focused on identity
That's true.
because you have groups that you want to be part of, and language is one of the ways that people decide whether you are an okay part of the group.
Yes.
As adults, it drops off a little bit, and so I think a lot of the students that we talked to found the idea that pronunciation was a strong part of their identity to be silly. A lot of them were Chinese, and they had a very strong feeling that they're Chinese. They knew they were Chinese. They would be Chinese no matter what they sounded like. But I don't think they had ever gotten to a point where they had to question whether they fit in a group or not. Elizabeth Gatmanton and Pavel Trofimovich and one other person in that 2005 special issue looked at how Chinese immigrants to Quebec, how they fit in terms of their use of English. And what they found in that study was that the people who had better English accents were trusted by the community as spokespeople to the outside, but they were not trusted as leaders inside.
Huh.
And so this identity is very complicated and it's a little bit hard. And I think that the study that we did, even though I really stand by it, I think it only began to hit the tip of what really was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, when I hear that, it speaks to this bi-directional nature of like additional language socialization, right? The learner can only do so much. It's up to, as you said, it's up to the target community as well, and the interlocutors and the role that they play in that. Yeah, it's really interesting.
And there's all kinds of interesting research on that. Jenny Miller in Australia did a research on high school students, immigrant high school students in Australia. And she found that accent, there was a complex thing going on between accent and what you look like.
Oh.
As to whether you were seen as worth listening to.
Wow.
She called it audibility, not intelligibility, but audibility. And that the kids who were not listened to became quieter and their English got worse. The ones who somehow got into the social, across that social barrier, either through humor or through looking the part or through accent, blossomed. But there were kids who became more and more inaudible because it was like nobody could even listen to them.
The question of if teachers need to earn more money to stay in ELT is really the wrong question these days. That one's largely been answered with precarity, 0-hour contracts, inconsistent work. The question isn't, do I need to earn more? The question really is, how do I make it work? Our TAP program, or Teacher Accelerator program, works with teachers like you directly to help make it happen. Through the process of being in the program, we help teachers build a lean, profitable, and pedagogically sound teaching business. 3 pillars that are really important to us. We started Learn Your English based on pedagogy, responsive pedagogy, evidence-supported teaching through research. One of the reasons we started this podcast as well. And we apply that now working with teachers to build courses, offers, and support for their clients in the same manner. The TAP program really is your roadmap to monetize your skills by, number 1, creating an irresistible offer, number 2, selling it effectively, and number 3, securing consistent clients, 3 pillars of any successful business. And while no one in ELT is building multi-million-dollar businesses in this fashion, it's a way for you and for all of us to first stay in the industry, to work with people that we love to help, to get paid for our work. And our goal for anyone who joins us in the program is within a 6 to 12 month period, you can make an informed choice, meaning you've built your business up to a certain point where you can use information to decide if keeping your school job and your business or just doing the business on its own is the right choice for you. If you want more information on if the program is a good fit for you or how we would work together, there's a link below. You can book a free chat with us. We can go through all of the details. There's lots of resources on our landing page, our website, and on this YouTube channel as well. And lots of interviews with clients that we've worked with where you can hear their stories, what it was like, and see if that resonates with you. If you're looking to earn a little bit more and really establish yourself in your niche, in your field this year, we'd love to chat. And now, let's get back to the show.
Hey, I'm Mike Sad from Kelowna, BC, and you're listening to Teacher Talking Time, the Learn Your English podcast.
I want to go back to the whole catching part because I think you talk about that in the paper, and I think it's related to what we're talking about here because from what I remember, a lot of language learners, they very much like myself at the time, they believe that they can catch a good pronunciation from a native speaker of that language, which is to me, as I said, akin to catching a cold. Oh yeah, if I just listen to this person, I can catch that. But what seems to be true is that a lot of them are not, at least I think Mike Andrew can also agree with that, is that a lot of these learners who want to improve their pronunciation, they don't seek out interactions with speakers of the language. And a lot of them, I would argue, and you said this in the paper too, a lot of them seem to undervalue the role of effective teaching in improving pronunciation. I think, what are your thoughts on that? What can learners do in terms of learning to engage more and working on their pronunciation, and specifically for language teachers? So maybe we can speak more about that. Are there any specific strategies, any tools that you would recommend for language educators that would help learners move beyond this misconception and eventually engage more?
I think part of it is just you have to engage, even though you're not ready, even though you're scared that you're not going to be understood, that to some extent, it's a little bit like riding a bicycle. You have to get out there and try it. I think from a teacher's point of view, if you can help students understand that there are certain things that are going to make a difference and other things that just aren't that important. So I have several times written about this in terms of I'm going to misname it, but basically the 80-20 principle, which has been something that was part of economics and a lot of other things, that 20% of the people in early 1900s Italy owned 80% of the land.
It's the Pareto principle. That's what it's called.
Thank you.
That brings back memories, Leo, for another podcast series.
I think with pronunciation, it's basically the same thing. That about 20% of the problems that any person has are going to make about 80% of the difference in terms of them being more successful in communicating. And the other 80% you just don't need to do anything about.
Okay.
That's what I would say for a teacher. And so a teacher needs to know that there are certain consonants or vowels that make a big difference. And there are others that just don't.
And you wrote about that, John. I think the word
Yeah.
that, I think if I'm connecting the dots correctly here, you call them high value pronunciation features.
Right. You actually have read more than my students have.
I like to do my homework. I'll be honest. I learn so much when we have new guests. It's my own, it's a PhD on my own terms because I'm learning from different fields. I'm just doing a little bit of everything. But I'm interested that you said that because in that specific paper that you wrote, you were talking about these things that make a difference, that the 20% that amounts to that 80. And one of these high value features that you discuss is contrastive stress,
Right.
which you said significantly improves, I think you've mentioned the word comprehensibility. I'm not 100% sure on that,
Right.
but how do you I'm more interested in the before we talk about the high value pronunciation, but how did you come to the conclusion that, or how do you determine that certain pronunciation features are high value?
I think that's a consequence of thinking about pronunciation in terms of intelligibility. That if you're thinking about what makes someone intelligible, we know that pronunciation can make people unintelligible. All you have to do is interact with somebody who has a different pronunciation. And you know that some things just get in the way. They just freeze you. And in the field, we've talked about this for a long time, that Jennifer Jenkins again argued that the TH sounds in English just weren't important. They weren't worth working on, even though they make English.
Right.
And then there are other things like the infamous L and R for Japanese speakers that cause trouble all the time. And so you start to question, what is it about L and R that's different from th and th? And we know that it has to do with the number of words that it can confuse.
It's true.
It's what we would call functional load.
Yeah.
But for super segmentals, or the rhythm and stress and melody of the language, it's a little bit different because we can't do minimal pairs. We don't confuse words based on them. And because I've worked on word stress and phrasal stress or prominence for a long time, I was very aware that contrastive stress was a big issue. That people, when they give presentations, would say they would talk about email or snail mail. Okay.
Right.
And what you hear is mail, right? Because we clue into those prominent words. And when you hear it the same way, your brain just fries a little bit. And so we had done some studies on contrastive stress, but we did it with high-level learners. And so we were playing with, can we take this down and go to low intermediate learners of English? And then we had to change our methodology. But it was an interesting study because when you ask learners to use this kind of contrastive prominence to call attention with their voice to the things that they're comparing, it makes a big difference. And that was where I think the high value pronunciation features was just a term that I came up with to go beyond the functional load issues for segmentals and move to other areas to name the 20%.
Right.
We seem to, this is fascinating, seem to have a very nice or neat dichotomy maybe here with accent and pronunciation. Accentism clearly is not universal, right? We can go anywhere and people can spot the accent. You can get caught.
Mhm.
But I'm sure it happened to you. And when I go to the US, we get past it very quickly. We have a good laugh, we have a drink, haha, and then have a nice conversation. It
Right.
is there with the pronunciation side, and you're getting to is there some with these high value features? Is there any universality to that in terms of teaching your intelligibility? You mentioned changing the methodology with the low level learners, which I'm really curious about of what you changed. But certainly accentism, there's no universality. Is there any universality on the intelligibility side?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure how to answer it.
I just asked the questions.
Yeah, if you, it, we would have to have people who, my guess is that there is some universality. So when a feature of the language has a high probability of causing confusion, then it becomes something that is more universal. So somebody who's learning Chinese has to get those tones. They just have to, because Chinese has a very simple syllable structure and it's got 4 tones. And so its syllables are pretty limited. I think it's about 1,400 different syllables, which means they have a lot of homophones. And they're distinguished only by whether your voice goes up or down or stays level or dips down and then goes up. And so that can confuse a lot of understanding, just like L and R in English. And then when you get to other types of prosody, we learn this kind of stuff when we're very little, right? By 5 months old, kids have the rhythm of their native language, have the rhythm. And it helps us but it also means that as we learn another language that has a different rhythm and melody, we don't notice it. We don't pay attention to it. We don't notice that it makes a difference in meaning. And so we do weird things with it.
What?
Interesting.
Yeah,
I don't know if that may not have answered your question.
No, that's a great answer. That's a great answer. Leo has a question, but I want to circle back on the methodology
no,
changes.
let's go back to the methodology, because I'm also interested in the methodology. Before we jump into the methodology, because I like that you named it. You call it, so basically we have low value and we have pronunciation features that are high value. That's the 20%, as you named it.
I would say,
And
yeah.
you're considering contrastive stress high value. What would be maybe a few other things that would be high value, just so teachers know and they can take note of that and be like, "Ooh, this is what we should be focusing on when teaching pronunciation"?
Let me stay with super segmentals because it's a little bit trickier. I think the difference between rising and falling intonation is high value, because we know that both rising and falling can be used with any grammatical structure. They can be used with yes, no questions or WH questions or statements or phrases. And it makes a huge difference as to whether you hear those things as inviting a response or making an assertion. So that's one. I think prominence is, in general, a high value thing. So what word do you emphasize in a phrase? In English, we like that emphasized word to be the last important word at the end of the phrase. And that's just the way English sounds. But then once you know that, if you do something different, carries meaning. Contrastive stress is a difference from the norm. Changing your emphasized syllable to something that is not at the end, but is informationally important is important. Word stress, some word stress is important and some doesn't matter at all, which is not very helpful. Teachers want to know word stress is important, but I'm in Iowa, which is a farming state, and we have these big machines that farmers use to pick corn that are called combines. And they have a different word that is used as a verb, which is combine. And so you would think this would make a big difference, but it doesn't seem to. If you hear somebody mispronounce combine as combine, your brain hums.
Figures it out.
Yeah, it figures it out. Both words show up.
Yeah.
If somebody says that they need a permit instead of a permit, the brain just gets them both. So that doesn't seem to matter, even though it's everything in all the pronunciation books, it's there. If somebody changes the vowels and stresses things wrong, then it shuts the listener down. I have an example of this from nearly 40 years ago. I was listening to Wilga Rivers, who was an Australian ESL methodologist. And I was listening, and she was perfectly easy to understand until she talked about a corollary.
A what?
Corollary.
Yeah, no idea.
Don't know that one.
It was it was corollary.
Oh.
Interesting. Okay.
Coral.
But
Crawley.
it took me about 45 seconds to figure out what the word was. I had to actually write down on a piece of paper in front of me, CRLRY. And then I thought, oh, yeah, I've heard that British speakers and then Australian speakers do this. But I couldn't understand it. She had changed all the vowels from what I expected with that stress change. And that made a big difference.
So she was not intelligible.
She was not intelligible. Everything else she said was intelligible, but she got me on that one.
You mentioned when listener, I think you said the listeners tune out. Is that the phrase is that the feed?
I think
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think it's thinking about.
I think I said freeze.
Freeze, okay. Or is that the feedback that we're looking for? I'm thinking of learners and students and thinking about like when they write something and someone submit and you read it and you give them the big red pen and you get feedback. And I'm thinking about pronunciation in the real world, so to speak, like what feedback, and this I think ties to everything that you've mentioned, like identity and just not wanting to be excluded or not wanting to be caught, as Leo felt in school. And sometimes in the real world, I imagine that when the others feel the person isn't intelligible, they tune out, but it's not obvious. They don't get a big red pen. They just, what is that the feedback that they're looking for? Or how does that work, do you think?
My students have described it a dozen times, or at least, as getting the look.
It sounds scary.
That when they're talking to someone and the person is not understanding them, they just go into this look of, it's usually the eyebrows down and squinting. and they know something has gone wrong, and they're not sure what it is, but in terms of pronunciation, they know that something has gone wrong.
Hmm.
I'm thinking of my
It's like,
local Chinese restaurant. They just hand me the English menu. Stop trying.
Yeah.
Here's the English menu. Yeah.
you should use one of those new phones that translates for you.
Ah,
Yeah,
oh, that's
exactly.
funny.
Yeah. The look.
The
Okay.
look. I got a lot of the looks in Paris when I was trying to speak French. They would automatically switch to English. It was the look followed by,
Right.
"Do you
Right.
speak
Yeah.
English?" And I said, "Yeah, I get it. You don't even want to try with me."
I hated the look in
Yeah.
Costa Rica when I lived there, and I was trying to speak Spanish, and they all just said, "Okay," and they just switched. And I was like, "No, I want to try. I want to like. I know I'm
Yeah.
bad. I get it, but humor me here."
You need to be very brave to continue
Mm-hmm.
in the language that you're working on when somebody else is rejecting you.
Basically, yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, these
Yeah.
are fun anecdotal stories, right? I was just there vacation. Mike could go to a different restaurant if he had to, but if you people are at work, they need the job, they're moving to a different country, they're immigrating, can be high
Right.
stake scenarios for this.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I always find it comical that French speakers switch to English, given that French accents are among the most marked accents in English.
Definitely.
I don't know if we're gonna go back to the methodology, Andrew, but I have two questions
Okay.
from the.
Let's do it.
Do you want to go back to the methodology
Good one.
quickly?
Yeah, I'm just
Sure.
really curious about when
Well, that'd be helpful.
what did you switch with the lower level? Yeah.
So what the switch, this came over several years, actually. This is one of those places where my wife, who was one of the co-authors with me on that paper, she thought about it a lot. And she said, we need pictures. We need, because we wanted to teach them contrastive stress without reading. The problem with reading is that contrastive stress gets really complicated very quickly. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do. You have multiple contrasts going on. And she figured out pictures, very simple pictures, where you would see in that article, you saw them, you had two pictures of a cat eating, one on the table and one under the table. And so you're forcing them to contrast the prepositions. And you're not asking them to read. And so they don't have that reading that gets in the way. And for lower level students, this is really important. And then we moved to pictures that had multiple contrasts in them. So you'd have two houses, one that's colored and one that's not colored, one that's small, one that's large, one that's a certain style and one's a different style. And when we would use those in class, we would ask student one to compare the two, give us sentences that they could do this. And they would come up with something, and then we'd go to another student and say, give me another comparison. And it had to be different. And if you have a decent set of pictures like this, you can get maybe 8 to 10 comparisons for each picture. And it was brilliant from a teaching point of view. They did really well with it. And it's really easy with pictures, we discovered as well, to get too complicated. You have to make it so that the comparisons are pretty blatant. So we tried it with weather maps, and weather maps were just total fail. They were like the complicated reading passages.
Right.
But it was those simple pictures that worked. Another one that we used was two bears. One was a small black bear and one was a big polar bear. And one of our teachers at that on this study added language where it would be the bear on the right over the left bear with while over the right bear. And so what we're doing is we're doing this, what we would call bridging activities, where we're asking them to do something where they have to be thinking about not only pronunciation, but something else. In that case, it was the lexical things that would allow them to frame their contrast more successfully.
Right. On
It worked really well.
Now you've like allowed basically created another question in my head, because you've mentioned that you want the students, you want learners to just do something beyond pronunciation. You don't want them to just think about
Yes.
pronunciation. And I'm wondering, in terms of, I have two questions, I think, before we wrap up, and then we can get ready for the surprise question in a second. But I'm wondering, in terms of transferability of skills, and I think in that study, the findings were very consistent in terms of showing improvement in comprehensibility after teaching that very specific high value pronunciation feature of contrastive stress. But if I'm remembering right, the same did not apply to fluency, which leads me to the question, which is similar to grammar, because we teach grammar explicitly, but that doesn't seem to translate into fluency. When it comes to pronunciation, John, what challenges do you see in terms of transferability in transferring learned pronunciation from very specific controlled classroom activities to more spontaneous, on the spot, real world communication?
In situ.
Yeah.
You hit one of the key questions. In that study, one of the reasons we tried to avoid the reading and we tried to focus really on just this kind of clear picture of comparing two things was to take us away from methodologies that focus on accuracy and freak students out and when it becomes time to be fluent. And I think you see this especially with lower level students. Fluency has to do with proficiency to some extent. The more you use the language, the more fluent you become. The less you've used the language so far, the less fluent you are. You speak more slowly. Your brain has to be thinking all the time about what's going to come out next, whether it's right, whether the word is correct, whether the grammar is correct, whether you're pronouncing things correctly. And so you end up being slower and less fluent. And so I think that you always are in the position of trying to be sensitive to not insisting on accuracy to the extent that you cause people to become less fluent. I don't know if you've ever worked with Korean students.
Yes.
There's something about the way that English is taught in many Korean classrooms, I think, that the students feel like they have a little policeman in their head.
Exactly.
They're constantly correcting themselves. They pay attention to the grammar, and so they don't speak very well. They don't speak very fluently in spontaneous situations. And we don't want to do that. And so I think this is one of those places where the suprasegmentals, the stress and rhythm and intonation are important because they fit better with fluency. and the pronunciation of TH sounds doesn't fit very well with fluency.
It's great that you said that because I think it's confirming a hypothesis that I've had for a long time that minimal pairs in pronunciation are the grammar McNuggets of a synthetic syllabus. It's pretty much the same. We teach all these minimal sounds and we expect students to synthesize and put them all together when they have to communicate, which is very much what we do with grammar. Before we get to the last question, John, there is one that when I announced that we were interviewing you for the podcast, I got a few questions. And one of the questions that I received, the person asked to be somewhat anonymous. So I'm not going to mention who the
Okay.
person was, but it's because I think it's a hot topic for language teachers in language education. I think in ESL, in ESOL, or whatever, English as an additional language, whatever you want to call it. And I know you also wrote a paper about it, so I think we can link this to the paper and talk about the question, which is the paper that you wrote on native and non-native teachers of second language pronunciation. And the question is simple because in your study, you suggest that non-native teachers can be just as effective as their native counterparts when it comes to teaching pronunciation. I think my question to you is, the research then says that students prefer or they have a bias towards the native speaker. But as you said, the study found no difference in terms of student outcome, having a teacher that is a native and a non-native. So I think the question is, how do you think educators in institutions can address and potentially, I know it's hard with education, but potentially change these perceptions among students?
I think that's hard, and mostly because it is the way that most of us think about pronunciation has to do with native or non-native. And so I think students are not victims of bad marketing. They're just victims of a limited way of understanding what's important.
Mm-hmm.
Having a native teacher is not necessarily a good thing. Native teachers can be stupid. They can be insistent that all you have to do is follow me. They can assume that a learner can actually do that and make sense out of what it is they're actually following. And non-native teachers almost always have gone through the pain of learning the language. They have a better sense of what the road is like from early on to later. And yes, students think the native teacher is better. They trust them more because they just know natives pronounce in a way that is reliable, and they don't have to worry about whether it's correct or not. I've taught a lot of teachers through the years, and my teachers in my pronunciation class always tutor some student. And the non-native teachers always are afraid that they're going to be found out. But some of them, many of them, have a brilliant strategy for this. And that is when they're teaching something that they have struggled with themselves, they move away from being the teacher, the authority, and they become a co-learner.
Yes, I like that.
No, it's important.
And when they become a co-learner, it's like all of the stress of follow me or I don't trust you drops away. And they're the ones who came up with this. And it's brilliant. It makes sense. It takes them away from trying to pretend that they don't still struggle some with this. And it puts them in a position of actually becoming much more of an authority than they could ever be in any other way.
The word trust, I think, is important there.
Yeah.
The old
Mhm.
binary choice, would you prefer this or this? And that's the only options you're giving them. Someone's going to make a decision, right? But if it's trust in
Right.
the institution that they have my best interest in mind, trust in the teacher if I'm choosing them myself, what's my goal? I believe this person can help me get there, or I don't, for a variety of reasons. Trust is probably the biggest word for me in that discussion.
Yeah. And it goes back to that thing you talked about, the kind of disease metaphor, that students are often afraid, at least from what they've expressed to me, that if they have a non-native teacher, they're somehow going to catch the disease
Yes.
that their non-native teacher has.
Which is crazy. Just
It's wild.
And they also think that if they have a native teacher, that this is going to provide a vaccine
exactly
against terrible pronunciation. But it doesn't work that way.
Right.
It doesn't work that way either way. They're not perceptive enough to know what they're listening to in the native language speaker, and they're not perceptive enough to know all of the things that are noticeable as non-native when they have a non-native teacher.
Yeah.
There's a lot of steps between where they are now and where they end up.
I like that analogy goes both ways. Yeah. Andrew, we're running out of time.
All
Would you
right.
like to do the honors?
I can do it for sure. So, John, at the end of every episode, we do a two-part exercise. One, we ask everyone we
Okay.
interview to leave a question for the next guest, even though you have no idea who that person will be. Anything you want. That's part two, so we'll come to that. But first, I have a question here that was left, in this case, for you. The other person didn't know it was going to be you either, but their question is the same one, I think, phrased two different ways. So I'll say both questions. The first one is, how can we engage learners to study language and continuing to go forward? And how can we ensure that people will continue to want to study languages?
I think we can engage them and ensure by giving them enough content that they see that it's valuable, and giving them enough enjoyment that they can see that it's worth continuing. So, is that a fair way to say it?
Fair to me. Sounds great.
And then I'm supposed to give you a question?
That's right. Anything you want. Can be pronunciation related,
Okay.
can be non-pronunciation. It doesn't even have to be teaching related. Just literally anything you want, and then we will ask the next person. That might be difficult for them to answer.
That one might be
Right.
pretty difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't see them in the fields here. Oh gosh, this is so hard.
Everyone
Hopefully
says
you're
that.
gonna edit this out.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I would say that going back to this idea of high value, I work in pronunciation, and so I have a pretty good sense of what's high value. But what are the high value things that you would focus on if you could only teach a couple of things to someone?
I like that.
So if they're a grammar teacher, what are they going to do? If they're a vocabulary person, what are they going to do?
I love that.
If they're a writing teacher, what are they going to do?
Oh, that's a good.
I like
very-
that. I
very
like the idea of
hands-on.
high value.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's good. It borrows, it drinks from the same fountain as the Pareto principle. I like that. John, before we wrap it up, talk a little bit about the conference, the pronunciation in second language learning and teaching. I know it's coming up. We can also, I know the episode is not going to come before then, but we can definitely spread the word. So if people know, maybe next year they can join.
This is the 15th year of the Pronunciation and Second Language Learning and Teaching Conference. Americans tend to call it PSLLT. Canadians call it PISLT.
That's what I would call a pistol.
Beautiful.
So yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Ron Thompson was the one who created that one. And we have about 120 people coming, people who research and teach pronunciation in a lot of different languages. The conference is meant to not be an English teaching conference. So we have a lot with Spanish, a lot with French, a lot with Chinese, Japanese, German. And it's always been a fun conference. It's not a conference where as my students called them one year, the famous people stay aloof from other people. There's a lot of interaction. We set the conference up so that people interact and get to meet the people that they've been reading or that they've heard about. It's very friendly. Next year, it will be in Montreal.
Oh, there.
And Concordia is going to host it.
Beautiful.
Nice.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
We should all meet there.
And
Yeah.
and it will probably be great. Pavitt Trofimovich and his group are the ones who are organizing it next year. About every 4 years, the conference is in Canada.
Okay, great.
And the other 3 in the States. And that's what it's been from the beginning. So
You can try out your Canadian accent again.
yes. You'll put me up in front of people and see if I can fake it.
That's great. That's great. So I think maybe next year, Andrew, we know where to go. We have lots of conference to go to next year.
Absolutely. On that note, if I can, just one more really quick question, because that conference just reminded me. Talking about that native speaker, non-native speaker idea, I guess in your career, John, and maybe since you started the conference as well, is there one thing that's changed the most in your research on pronunciation, or in a different way, what gives you optimism about the future or the direction of where pronunciation teaching is going?
Great question.
What gives me optimism is that almost nobody comes from a point of view anymore of thinking that you have to be native-like in order to be accomplished as a speaker of the additional language that you're learning. And almost nobody thinks that you have to insist on native-like weird pronunciations in order to fake it, in order to pass. So even though students still think this way, and even though administrators still think this way, almost nobody in the field thinks this way anymore. And I think that's good. Because what you need is, if people are going to teach pronunciation in any language, they need to understand what it is they're teaching. They need to have, like any teacher, a bag of tricks that they can use to teach. And they need to have sympathy for their students and that it's going to be hard. And I think that we've moved in that direction. And I think it's really helpful that we get people who are now working a lot in things like Spanish and German and Chinese, because they bring insights that you don't get if you just work on English.
Amazing.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. John, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.